When Karoline Leavitt took the stage at a small-town gathering, she expected the usual questions about politics, leadership, and the future of the country. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment that would leave her speechless, struggling to hold back tears. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, stood up in the crowd. Her tiny hands gripped the microphone as she looked up at Karoline with wide, innocent eyes. The room fell silent, everyone leaning in to hear what she had to say. And then, in the softest voice, she asked, "Miss Leavitt, do you think God still listens to us?" It was such a simple question, yet it carried the weight of something far deeper. In that moment, Karoline's composed demeanor wavered. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to push back the unexpected wave of emotion washing over her. The audience, too, seemed to hold their breath, waiting to hear how she would respond. She knelt down slightly so she could meet the little girl at eye level. Taking a deep breath, she smiled warmly and said, "Sweetheart, that's one of the most important questions anyone could ever ask." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Yes," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "God always listens. Even when we feel like He's far away, even when things seem uncertain, He is always there." The little girl nodded, as if absorbing every word, but then she followed up with another question that made Karoline's heart ache even more. "Then why do so many people feel sad or lost?" A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a question that many adults struggled with, and here was a child, bravely seeking an answer. Karoline took another deep breath. "That's a really good question," she said gently. "Sometimes life can be hard. We go through challenges and we don't always understand why. But even in our toughest moments, God gives us strength. He puts people in our lives to help us, and sometimes He uses us to bring hope to others." The little girl's eyes lit up. "So I can help people too?" Karoline felt a lump form in her throat. "Yes, you absolutely can," she said, her voice nearly breaking. "Even the smallest acts of kindness, like a smile, a hug, or simply listening to someone, can make a big difference." The audience was completely silent, some wiping away tears, deeply moved by the exchange. One woman in the front row placed a hand over her heart, while a man nearby nodded solemnly. Karoline looked at the little girl and said, "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl answered shyly. "Well, Emma, you just reminded all of us of something really special today," Karoline said warmly. "You reminded us to never stop asking questions, to always look for hope, and to never forget that we are never alone." A round of soft applause began to spread through the crowd, growing louder with each second. Emma smiled, clutching the microphone tightly before handing it back. After the event, as Karoline greeted attendees, Emma and her mother approached her. The mother, eyes glistening with unshed tears, whispered, "Thank you." That meant the world to her. Karoline knelt down once more and took Emma's hand. "You are a very special girl," she told her. "Never stop believing, okay?" Emma nodded enthusiastically before hugging her. It was a moment that Karoline knew she would never forget. Later that night, as she reflected on the encounter, she realized something. In the midst of debates, campaigns, and political noise, sometimes the most profound moments come from the simplest voices. And in that moment, through the eyes of a little girl, she was reminded of the power of faith, hope, and the unshakable belief that even in our darkest times, we are never truly alone. As Karoline Leavitt sat in her car that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something truly profound had happened. She had spent years navigating the world of politics, answering tough questions from reporters, debating policy, and standing firm in her beliefs. But nothing, no interview, no speech, no debate, had ever touched her heart the way Emma's question had. She thought back to her own childhood, to the moments when she had wondered about the same things. She remembered sitting in church, listening to sermons about faith and perseverance. She remembered times when she had prayed for answers, hoping that God was listening. And now, years later, here she was, face to face with a little girl asking the very same question that had once echoed in her own heart. The truth was, even as adults, people wrestled with doubt. The world could be a hard place. There were struggles, losses, disappointments, and yet in that moment, she had felt something undeniably real. A reminder that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about holding on even when things don't make sense. Karoline pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to a close friend. Tonight reminded me why I do this. Sometimes the smallest voices ask the biggest questions. As she drove back to her hotel, her mind kept replaying the scene. The way Emma had looked up at her, so full of hope. The way the audience had fallen completely silent, as if every single person had been touched by the weight of that question. It wasn't just Emma who had needed reassurance that night. It was everyone in that room. And maybe that was the point. The next day, Karoline found herself thinking about how often people go through life feeling unheard, as if their prayers are met with silence. But maybe, just maybe, moments like this were a reminder that God doesn't always answer in grand, earth-shaking ways. Sometimes he speaks through the innocence of a child. Sometimes he moves through the hearts of strangers. And sometimes
he shows up in unexpected places, like a small-town gathering where a little girl's question could bring a room to tears. Later that week, Karoline shared the story during an interview.
The host asked her what had been the most meaningful moment in her journey so far, and without hesitation, she recounted her exchange with Emma. There are moments in life that remind us of something bigger than ourselves, she said. Moments where you feel God's presence so strongly that you can't ignore it. That night, when that little girl asked me if God still listens to us, I felt something I can't quite explain. It was humbling, and it was a reminder that no matter how noisy the world gets, there are still voices asking the most important questions, and we owe it to them to answer with honesty, with kindness, and with faith. The interview clip went viral. People from all walks of life shared their own stories, times they had questioned, times they had doubted, times they had felt God's presence in unexpected ways. Messages poured in from parents who said their children had asked similar questions. A pastor reached out saying he had used the story in his Sunday sermon. Someone even sent a message saying, "I haven't prayed in years, but hearing this made me want to try again." And perhaps that was the real impact of that moment. One little girl, one question, and a ripple effect that reached farther than anyone could have imagined. Weeks later, Karoline received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Emma. Dear Miss Leavitt, thank you for answering my question. I told my friends what you said, and now we are trying to help people more. We made cards for kids in the hospital, and we told them God is always listening. I think you were right. Little things can make a big difference. Love, Emma. Tears welled in Karoline's eyes as she folded the letter carefully, placing it in her journal. Yes, little things do make a big difference. A few months later, Karoline Leavitt found herself in a different part of the country, speaking at another event. The crowd was larger this time, and the topics of discussion were heavier: policy, leadership, and the future of the nation. But, as she stood before the audience, she couldn't shake the memory of Emma's question. As she wrapped up her speech, she took a deep breath and decided to share the story. A few months ago, she began, a little girl named Emma asked me a question that I haven't been able to forget. She asked me if I thought God was still listening to us. The room grew quiet, just like it had that night. I was so moved by her innocence, by her honesty. And it made me realize something. This world is full of noise. We get caught up in the debates and the headlines and the division. But in the midst of all that, there are still children who just want to know if someone is listening, if someone cares. She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some people nodded. Others leaned forward, hanging on to every word. Emma reminded me that no matter how chaotic life gets, no matter how uncertain things seem, there is still hope. There are still Moments that remind us we are not alone. And sometimes the biggest truths come from the smallest voices. When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. But as she stepped off the stage, something unexpected happened. A woman approached her, her eyes filled with emotion. "My son asked me the same question a few weeks ago," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know how to answer him at the time, but now I do. Thank you for sharing that story." Karoline squeezed the woman's hand, feeling the weight of what she had just said. It was moments like this that reminded her why. She had chosen this path, not just to speak, not just to lead, but to listen, to remind people of the things that truly mattered. That night, as she sat in her hotel room, she pulled out Emma's letter once again. "We made cards for kids in the hospital, and we told them God is always listening." She smiled, thinking about how one small moment had sparked something bigger. A little girl had taken her words to heart, had shared that message with others, had made an impact in ways she might never fully realize, and that was the beauty of faith. It didn't have to be grand. It didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was as simple as a child asking a question, a leader answering with honesty, and the ripple effect of kindness spreading farther than anyone could have imagined. As she turned out the light and closed her eyes, Karoline whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for Emma, for the people who still believed in hope, and for a God who always listens, even in the smallest voices. A few weeks later, as Karoline Leavitt prepared for another event, she received a message from Emma's mother. It was a short but powerful note. "Emma talks about you all the time. She keeps saying, 'I know God listens because he sent someone to answer me.' Thank you for giving her that reassurance." Karoline sat still for a moment, rereading the message over and over. It was humbling to realize the impact of a single conversation. She had answered Emma that night, but in reality, it was Emma who had given her something even greater, a reminder of the power of faith, kindness, and the profound wisdom that comes from the pure heart of a child. That night, Karoline decided to write back. "Please tell Emma that her words have traveled farther than she can imagine. She has reminded people, myself included, that faith is not just about knowing all the answers, but about trusting even when we don't. And tell her that because of her, I will always remember to listen with my heart." The next morning, Karoline stood before another crowd. She spoke about leadership, about standing firm in your values, about the challenges facing the nation. But at the end of her speech, she paused. "There's one more thing I want to share with you," she said. "It's about a little girl named Emma." And once again, the room fell silent. As she recounted the moment that had moved her to tears, she could see the emotion ripple through the audience. Some people dabbed their eyes, others nodded in deep understanding, and just like before, after the event ended, people came forward, mothers, fathers, grandparents, each with their own stories. "My granddaughter asked me that same question not long ago," one woman said. "I didn't know what to say then, but now I do." A man in his 40s shook her hand. "You reminded me why I started going to church again," he admitted. "I had almost given up, but hearing that story, it brought me back." Karoline left that event feeling something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just about politics or speeches, it was about something much deeper. People were yearning for connection, for reassurance, for hope. And sometimes, that hope came from the most unexpected places. A few months later, she was invited to speak at a charity gala for children's hospitals. As she stood backstage, reviewing her notes, she heard a small, familiar voice say, "Miss Leavitt?" She turned, and there stood Emma. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then a huge smile spread across her face. "Emma!" she exclaimed, bending down to hug the little girl. "What are you doing here?" Emma grinned. "We came to help. My mom told me this event is for kids who are sick, so we brought cards and gifts for them. I wanted to tell them what you told me, that God is always listening." Tears welled up in Karoline's eyes again. This little girl had not only taken her words to heart, but had turned them into action. "You are amazing," Karoline whispered, holding Emma's hands. "Never stop being who you are." Emma beamed. "I won't." That night, as Karoline took the stage, she didn't need notes. She didn't need a script. She spoke from the heart, sharing Emma's story once more. And by the end of the night, thousands of dollars had been raised for children in need, all because one little girl had asked a question that had moved the world. As Karoline looked out over the crowd, she realized something powerful. Sometimes, the greatest leaders aren't the ones standing at podiums. Sometimes they're the ones sitting in the audience, asking the simplest but most important questions. And sometimes those questions change lives.